This sea level graph from NASA has changed rather dramatically over the past 2 months. The graph shows rapid sea level rise from the early 1920s until the early 1950s, and then almost no sea level rise until the end of the 1970s. But since the early 1990s, the graph shows a very sharp increase in the rate of sea level rise. Let's take a closer look at the trends. According to the current NASA graph, sea level rose from 1950 until the early 1990s at a rate of about 0.75 millimeters per year. But according to the current graph, after about 1990, the rate of sea level rise increased by a factor of more than 4. The next graph I'm going to show you is what the data looked like on the day Camel and Joe took office. On January 28, 2021, NASA showed a fairly steady rate of sea level rise. First, let's cover a very important principle about how water behaves. Water seeks a level surface. If the level of the water rises over here, then it has to rise over here too, and over here, and everywhere else on the body of water. This principle is why many people used to believe that the Earth is flat. They would look out across the ocean and all they would see is a flat surface of water. This is important because if there was a huge increase in the rate of sea level rise, as the current NASA graph shows, we would expect to see it in essentially every single tide gauge in the world. All of the oceans are interconnected, so if sea level rise rates actually increased by a factor of 4, we would have to see it in pretty much every single tide gauge on the planet. We would expect to see a sharp break and slope upwards around the year 1993. Let's look and see if that break and slope shown in this graph is real. Here's the tide gauge for New York City, which has been operating since before Abraham Lincoln was president. The rate of sea level rise there has been pretty steady for the past century and a half, and there certainly hasn't been a break and slope since the year 1990. If the NASA global sea level graph were correct, we would expect to see a sharp increase in slope at New York after the year 1990, but it doesn't exist. And it's the same story at Atlantic City, New Jersey. Sea level rise rates have been quite constant there for more than 100 years. There's no indication of any human influence. Most of the apparent sea level rise on the east coast of the United States is actually due to the land sinking rather than the ocean rising. If we go to the west coast, we see very little or no sea level rise at all. At Crescent City, California, sea level has fallen a little bit over the last 90 years, and definitely no break in slope after the year 1990. In Greta's home country of Sweden, sea level is falling rather sharply. This is because the land is rising there since the end of the last ice age. And there's definitely no break in slope after the year 1990. Same story at Sydney, Australia. They have a very long-term record. There's been very little change in slope and no break after the year 1990. Sea level at Sydney has hardly risen at all over the past 130 years. This sharp break in slope, which NASA claims after the year 1990, simply doesn't exist. This data is fake.